Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here, and get ready for Gnosis. Well, this is a new series of the most overrated. Now, months ago, I started this series talking about Bruce Lee, and I want to continue now with a person called Christopher Hitchens. Um, I'm assuming most people know about him. He's the famous anti-theist, as he classifies himself, meaning he's opposed to all religions. Most people would call him an atheist. If you're an atheist, I'm assuming that means all religions. But to classify it, and he considers all religions as false, harmful, and authoritarian. Um, it's a very interesting guy, but he's a very, Americans in particular seem to be overly impressed by the British, who basically have always looked down upon the Americans, and basically, even in initial history, considered them hillbillies and horribly harassed them for almost their entire existence, particularly after the Revolutionary American War. And the reason why they were kicked out by the colonists in general is because they're kind of a nasty group of people, as most Brits are. So, and they harassed Americans ever since the Revolutionary War. I mean, previous to that, one of the reasons, as I said, where they were kicked out, was the fact that they continued to harass, and actually were harassing the United States up to World War One in many different areas until they begged for our help, of course. But it's a long story, and even people who kind of respected the original British, like Benjamin Franklin, um, grew to hate them because they treated him like he was a hillbilly. Oh, that American. Oh, I bet he ties his shoes with butter. So, whatever it is that the Brits seem to find that they're so superior at. Like losing every empire they've ever had, and pretty much every war they've been in ultimately. Um, so they really looked down upon it. It's interesting that Benjamin Franklin's son was a loyalist, meaning he stayed with the Brits during the American War. Yet his father, who was spent a lot of time in Britain, and I believe he was an ambassador there. I'm not 100% sure, but he really wanted to be accepted by the British and work with them, and they totally and completely rejected him, which they did to most, quote, Americans. I mean, you would look down at them as being, them being so superior, and of course, the Americans just being, hillbillies working in the fields. And of course, this is very typical of Brits all over the world and what they've done. Now, this is a very interesting character when we start talking about Hitchens. And it's also interesting of the many, many different changes of positions, his moving around the political spectrum to make money, who he buys into, etc. And of course, his ultimate death here. Well, it comes from an interesting family as well. It's a very working class family, you would call it. His father basically was a bookkeeper, and he worked for speedboat manufacturers, bookkeeping for a bit, and he worked at a prep school apparently. So I'm not really sure, and it doesn't state without going, and there's no need to go into great detail. We're giving you background here. If the details are slightly off, so what? We're just giving you a shotgun understanding it. But his father, Eric Ernst Hitchens, and his mother, whose maiden name was Hickman. Um, so the whole idea is that that's what he did, and his father, of course, like almost everybody in Britain, was active in World War II, in the Navy. His mother apparently was Jewish, and something he found out apparently later in life, but whatever that means. But of course, he was not. He wasn't brought up in any like so many Jewish people. They really may be Jewish by some sort of heritage, but they were not practicing Jews, and he was brought up in a quasi-religious household. Um, a Christian household, I should say, and that's pretty much his background. So nothing there, but it's very interesting. I don't think a lot of people know about his real background. There's an awful lot that I'm going to cover here and try and move through it at a. So he was able to get into. And I don't know how it works there for someone who doesn't have any money, but he got into one of the many satellite schools of Oxford. He didn't go to the official Oxford. Um, Balnell is he ultimately where he graduated from, and other schools. I'm not sure how he got in there. He has a brother. All those things are. I always wonder about that because it's very expensive to get into it. Did he get in on scholarships because he was smart enough or whatever? I don't know. I think all of that is highly overrated for him, and I don't really think he's a very deep thinker. He's got that typical British accent. He speaks clearly and then is assumed that he's so intelligent and smart, and I don't agree with that whatsoever. And we'll look into all those things. And like most, people put on a certain image, speak in a certain way, and people buy into they're so intelligent. This has happened to so many people, and that's why I'm doing this most overrated. The same thing with Bruce Lee. The bottom line is Bruce Lee never was in any competition of championships or fighting. He never fought anybody else in a championship or a competition manner. So regardless of how good he looked, what a consummate actor he was, and people liking him and coming off on the screen very well. And there's a lot of I would say most martial artists who are very competent don't come off well on the screen. So people think, oh, they're not very good. Well, Bruce Lee was an actor since he was 5. His father was an actor. He knew what to do, and that doesn't put down his knowledge and training, but he never fought in competition. So you can't call him a fighter. You can call him a martial artist. So there's a lot of people now that haven't been in competition, a lot of them that have, and a lot of them that were ex-military. Chuck Norris was ex-military. So was Joe Louis. He was a Marine. So the whole idea is these guys were fighters and fought in competition. So we need to understand that as we can carry this on to Christopher Hitchens and others who come off in a particular way. And I will cover Terence McKenna, another boob out there, that people give too much credit to. Now, I've never been overly impressed by Hitchens. A lot of people think that he's got all these great lines and everything else, but, he certainly in his debates are relatively amusing. I've never heard him come up with anything overly earth-shattering. And people just idolize him. And I'll get into this as well as a recent interview I watched with him where he was older and a little more feeble because of his illness and was having trouble with his microphone. So, and he stated this, well, I hope this isn't me, and blah, blah, blah. And the whole idea is the entire audience erupted in laughter, feeding him back that, oh, this is another brilliant. No, he was fumbling. He didn't get the microphone. He couldn't figure out how to use it properly. So the whole idea is that they're giving him credit for something that, oh, look at how cute, unique. No, he was fumbling. I mean, what is that? This is a kind of knee-jerk reaction to people that somehow gives them credibility when they don't. And Hitchens was not a deep thinker. And we'll get into that as well. Let's get back into his history. Like so many pseudo-intellectuals, I hear this all the time from these people, and it's part of being brainwashed in colleges, etc., is they quote the, quote, masters of literature out there. Great books that, well, everybody says this is a great book. You know, they say that about the Bible, too, Chrissy boy, yet you don't like that book. But he likes to quote all the masters, which I always find to be quite boring. And I don't find that something written 200, 300, 400 years ago, or even 100 years ago, has a lot of impact on my life. It's very much of a, okay, interesting information, but how does that correlate to a modern time where things are very different? And of course, he falls into the usual Illuminati control type person, which I'll get into as well. So the whole idea is that when we look at these things, we need to be very careful of giving people credibility. And while some people, and he had some interesting statements about religion, that you can look at and say, that's an insight. In the bigger picture, to say that this person is so smart and knows everything, well, we'll point out how this is a fallacy pretty much with everybody. And we have to be very careful. The same thing goes with so many other speakers out there. And he is definitely one of the most overrated people that I've ever heard talk about. And of course, his philosophy is embraced, considered to be very left politics, but it goes even more than that. He considers himself a Marxist. So he considers himself a Marxist communist, basically. So he's very, very left-wing there. Now, people don't like to use the word communism. They used to use Marxist because it's a purer form, but he's very much into that. I'm assuming because of coming from his low-income background of being suppressed and not being able to make much money, which is very typical, and of course that pushes you to that. But he is very much of a radical leftist. You're talking about a Marxist. You're not talking about a liberal. He didn't like liberals or so forth. He wants to label himself as a traditional Marxist, which is a very strong word for most people. And of course, personally, I think that Marx had a lot of good, who was a German, not who was supported by rich people, which is interesting in his later life. Not too many people bought into his philosophy, and the only way that he could continue to function was that he was supported by a rich British person who brought him over to England and basically subsidized him. And of course, I do agree with a lot of Marxist belief systems, how people are made into numbers and checks, and you're made into, instead of being a human being, you're nothing more than a paycheck for these people, something to be used like a machine. So I agree with a lot of that, and certainly, apparently, he saw that. Hitchens became part of the Labor Party in 1965. But Hitchens, when he was growing up, which I think is another interesting thing, I don't think too many people know that, and also could account for his greater hatred of religion. Hitchens was bisexual during his most of his younger years, and I'm not sure that ever changes, even though for personal empowerment and to get jobs and to function in society, he married a couple of times, and we don't know what was going on behind the scenes. I tend to think that these kind of predilections and desires don't change with age. But in his younger days, and he has joked that he became unattractive, that only women would want him as he got older, meaning that it wasn't the fact that he chose not to be a homosexual, he was pushed out of it, is how you can look at that. Now, certainly he would look at that. He claimed to have sexual relations with 2 male students at Oxford, who later became Tory ministers under Margaret Thatcher, meaning they were conservatives. But, the British have a long history of homosexuality, but it's also interesting to note that basically he was committing an illegal act. Another thing that would push him towards his more non-conservative belief systems. It wasn't legal to be a homosexual in England until 1969. Now, that's pretty hard to believe because the entire British system of sending a bunch of adolescent kids into male-only schools is known for its homosexuality. So you've got all the end of different ages. They mix young kids in with teenagers, and who are teenagers going to express their sexuality to, especially since there's no females? Well, it's all the rest of the people, and you're sleeping next to them. So this is very typical of British society and something that Britain is known for, as so many places in Europe, particularly the Germans, who have the largest amount of homosexuals in the world, are in Germany. So the whole idea is that these things have to be understood if that they were perpetrating this, and these are phases that generally teenagers or younger children go through, as they are generally around the same sex. So this is an experimentation and a primitive need, so it's not unusual for younger people, even starting in teenage years, to experiment with everything from brothers and sisters to others that they're around, which will be of the same sex. So a lot of that is normal, but that's not what he did here. Actually, you're talking about in college, where it's quite a bit different when you start doing that. So that means that this is something you're interested in and pursuing, and so that is, I think that's important to be noted. And the fact that he just happened to then also marry a few women while his career was going, well, I'm not sure he had much of a choice. And it seems like a lot of his career is based on how am I going to make money from this instead of how strong his opinions are. He also was not a very analytical thinker. All these people that go back to, it said this back then and all there, and going back to all these old books which they quote from all the time, instead of having their own opinion, shows a small thinker. Now, you're supposed to gather information and then synergistically put it together and come up with your own opinion based on your life, what you've learned now, and adapting it to modern understandings instead of just going back and taking it verbatim from anything that was written. But most people don't do that, and they start quoting people. One of the most annoying things don't quote me stuff from what somebody else says. Tell me what you think. I don't need to have a quote. I'll go read that book. I don't need to sit here and talk to you if you're going to quote from an idiot book. It shows a very small thinker, and this is very typical. And of course, this is part of academia because they want you to be brainwashed. So, well, it's not what you think, it's what somebody else said. Well, what did that other person who wrote that down? Did they tell him that? It's not what you think, it's what somebody else said. And of course, it keeps going back and back until we get quotes from the dinosaurs. And of course, we do have to keep in mind that this guy is a Marxist. He was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, otherwise known as the Communists. So it's very interesting that this guy is a communist. And the bottom line is that he's also pushing a typical socialistic venue that God is scum. Now, I certainly agree with the stupidity that religion does, but we've looked at the so-called communist countries, and of course they are communists. They're not Marxists, and there's a big difference. The actual beliefs of Marx were never properly put into use in the Soviet Union, China, etc. They're basically a fascist under, well, we're taking care of you, buddy. We all have the same, except me, the leader. I have Dom Perignon champagne and Cuban cigars, and you get water. Because that's what we all do. We're all in this together, except me. So the whole idea is that that's the problem with communism, as we know it from Red China and also from Russia in general, which is nothing more than a criminal organization. That's what basically the Soviet Union was and is. So when we do into this, it's very interesting to note that. So, and of course, they're anti-religion. Now, the point is, these anti-religious people, otherwise known as communists, certainly have not built a moral society without God. Certainly, we haven't built a moral society with God. So, obviously, both systems don't work and have little value. Plain and simple. So, to think one is better than the other, I think, is naive again. I mean, obviously, what has communism built? Period. Right now, we have a horrible corruption in China. They kill more people than anybody else. What have they built? Well, they built a lot from who? Christian money, meaning the Europe, which is their number one customer, followed by the United States. So they didn't build anything internally from their great belief system. Just like the Nazis couldn't build a society based on their goofball thinking. They had to go around and murder everybody else. Well, that really shows that your actual understanding and your philosophies, when put into actual action, don't work. So he's got the typical Communist Party attitude. Religion's bad, it's the people, and everything else, because he was struggling in life. And I don't think he's done well, period, and certainly didn't come from a middle class or upper middle class. His father, being an accountant, made mediocre money. I'm sure if he came from a middle class or wealthier family, he would be a Tory, and he would be pushing that line as well. So again, it's not a big thinker, it's what he was born into and what he continued to follow. I'm not going to go into all he's written for and accomplishments and everything else. You want to look into all that stuff, that's up to you. We're talking about the man here, his thinking, what he's done, what magazines and books he wrote, yawn, yawn, yawn. He was a journalist where he made most of his money, apparently foreign journalist, and that's where he met his first wife in Cyprus, where he was a reporter, and she was a Greek Cypriot, and they had 2 children together. Just to give that background, since I've stated, of course, his initial and primary, apparently, sexuality, which was homosexuality. And of course, he was married to her for a period of time. Then in 1989, he met and married in 1991 Carol Blue, who was, they met in Los Angeles. So he's had these 2 wives, and to clarify this shift later in his life when he started off being basically homosexual and then changed over, which isn't all overly unusual, but certainly just another factor of why people are so anti-religion. Well, who is anti-homosexual? Well, the church. He's come out against a lot of people, including people like Bill Clinton. I'm not sure that that's overly surprising. Not very many people like him, and Hillary Clinton as well. All of these people were not overly liked, even though were supported for many years, and Bill Clinton actually left the White House with a surplus. But he's one of those people that has been horribly, and probably rightfully so, they're very backstabbing also. But that's another issue. But he was very much against him because he considered him a false liberal, which he was coming off as. And it's true. Clinton put through all these horrible trade packages and acted like a Republican, not like a people's candidate. Now, he married and had 1 child with Carol Blue, who is apparently a screenwriter from Los Angeles, and possibly, apparently, maybe Jewish, for whatever that means. But we're trying to figure out the personality and what influences him. And, of course, he is half Jewish himself. His mother was Jewish again, whatever, again, that means. But I think it's important to understand where people are coming from. There's some very interesting facts here as well, some tragedies that I'm not sure how this impacts someone or what they actually believe, but could further antagonize his religious beliefs. And in November 1973, Hitchens' mother committed suicide in Athens in a pact with her lover, a deflocked, interesting, clergyman named Anthony Bryan. The pair overdosed on sleeping pills in adjoining hotel rooms, and Bryan slashed his wrists in the bathtub, which is certainly a horrible way to go, and got to show some serious problems there. And I'm not sure why this was going on here and what the full story was. They couldn't be together for one reason or another, and trying to pull a Romeo and Juliet, I find that hard to believe. And of course, this is 1973, so this is quite a long time ago. But of course, he was much younger there, and this had a horrible effect on him. It must have. Hitchens flew alone, strangely. Where was his brother? I don't know what happened to his father. To Athens to recover his mother's body, which he was thinking she was murdered. So to actually go there and find all this out must have been a trauma among all traumas. Certainly, this is a horrible thing to have to go through, and I don't know how much he witnessed or whatever, but having to identify bodies and doing the other things as a teenager that he was, and I'm not sure it was his teens, but he was very young, must have been extremely traumatizing. But his views are very strange, and let's cover his views when you really get down to it. They were very Marxist, communist in nature, that believe in absolutely nothing, seeing only that the fact that we're all meat puppets and nothing else exists. Meaning the fact that he really never did any serious research. Reading classic, boring literature that appeals to a class of pseudo-intellectual, brainwashed idiots is all he really got into. But, when you start quoting those names of the classic writers, well, who can argue with you? Well, I've always argued with you, and people look at you like you're a fool. Don't you know that's a great author? What do you mean a great author? You mean because a bunch of pseudo-intellectuals said so, and that you're now told you have to read these books, and then of course instead of interpreting them properly, you take them as virtually born-again Christian type ideas. Well, I mean, that's where he's coming from. Was he analytical? Well, no, he wasn't. He was really had this strange doctrine that he followed of believing in meat puppets, even though the entire literature of the world, done by many people, even very, quote, scientific or even conservative like Freud and other people who recognize the fact of all these other things. He of course would never believe in quantum physics and everything else. He believes in Newtonian physics. This is the kind of mind you're dealing with, regardless of the evidence that was brought out. His big supporters are kind of that he also considers his friend because they are also atheists, are people like Penn and Teller. Really the garbage can bottom of the entire thought process out there, including the unamazing Randy. Well, here's a sewer stinking mentality that we need to re-examine. So embracing these kind of people who are highly corrupt means that he's in bed with them, grabbing onto any allies he can get without intellectualizing the process. The fact that quantum physics is the reality and that all that goes with that, which you have to accept, if you accept quantum physics, you have to accept an entirely different nature of man. Now, he couldn't do that reading all these old crappy books that he was so in love with. You would have to embrace new thinking, educate yourself properly, instead of just quoting what you were taught in some goofball school. This he could not do. He'd like to do all sorts of things, including attack anybody who was of a religious nature, and whether this is valid or not is unknown. But having such a low-level mind where he doesn't understand quantum physics, he doesn't understand the, quote, real reality of life, the subatomic nature of life, the parapsychological, the metaphysical reality, which are terrible terms because they sound so unscientific. The fact is that the understanding of the nature of life and its energetic vibrational field energy is a very superior thought form that few people can embrace because they're listening to clown college graduates, deviates, and criminals, convicted criminals like the famous skeptic Brian Dunning. So the point is that these are his pals. These are the people he goes to for support. Because, why? Because they're atheists. Not because they're smart or because they have thought things out. They're atheists. So, I mean, this is a childlike response to put yourself in bed with a bunch of other people. I frankly doubt any of these people would come out and say that they were Marxist. It's almost impossible for Mr. $150 million network Penn Jillette to come out and say that he's a Marxist. Yeah, he cries for the masses while he sticks millions of dollars in his pocket. That's the reality of it. So, this is a very important understanding to show somebody who is a very low-level thinker that is just quoting stuff to get attention. Now, I've listened to all his talks and everything else, and as I said, I'm not overly impressed with him. Certainly, he spoke fairly well. Well, there are millions of people that do that, and it doesn't take a British accent, which Americans fall on their knees worshiping. His information that he got was not very interesting. He did not attack things as he should have. And while he came out and was a fervent opponent to Islam, he really did discuss there's so many things that go with that. So, and his cross-the-board condemnation of everyone is kind of childish in nature. So, certainly, believing in comic book realities, which religion gives you, is certainly something to reject. Rejecting everything in this life as having no understanding or basis in science because you don't understand it is ignorant buffoonery. And you are guilty of that, Christopher Hitchens. Ignorant buffoonery of the fact that you didn't look deeper into 150 years of very important consciousness research in the entire field of human consciousness, what's going on, and, quote, parapsychology, another terrible word. So none of that would he give. He would go to the ignorant buffoons, his buddies, Penn and Teller and the unamazing Randy, all people who I allege work for corporate interests. That's who his buddies were. So, I mean, this kind of buffoonery, ignorant buffoonery, is, of course, puts him on a very low level and no better than the people that he are his opponents. You also have to wonder what kind of mentality a person has if they are someone who has acquired and kept continuing horribly chain smoking and abusing alcohol, apparently. But he was a chain smoker all his life. You can see him in many interviews, like most of these horribly addicted, infantile mind people smoked all the time, even during debates and interviews, etc. It's not unusual to see him doing that. So the fact that he would acquire cancer later, esophageal cancer later, is not overly surprising. Very typical of heavy smokers. And how much drink contributed, I don't know. But like most Brits, he seems to be a big drinker. But of course, alcohol in large amounts is a problem. But, most of the people living longer all are drinkers. So this is, of course, overemphasized. But smoking cigarettes is certainly, there's no question of how horribly toxic they are. Now, is that something that an informed, intelligent, advanced thinking man does? No, but a buffoon, an imbecilic buffoon thinker would smoke cigarettes. Talking about the great wisdoms of life while puffing on a cigarette. So, this is just absurd. So this is the kind of people and contradictions that we have to deal with. So obviously he didn't get the facts and understood how terrible this was for him. Or was he just a suicidal maniac like pretty much everybody is who's super fat, smokers, or does anything really negative? Well, you are killing yourself. So it's just not instantaneous. Also, so the whole idea is that he got this cancer and he died at a fairly young age. And what's interesting is what he died of as well. We'll go into that, but he died at age 62 at a cancer center in Texas, which I find interesting. But it's interesting how he was able to jump on a new cancer treatment, which maxes out the human genome. And selectively targets damaged DNA to try and fight cancer and to restore the body. Well, it's interesting that him, as this great believer in all of these types of things, and a believer in science, would go with a completely new cancer treatment for his particular condition, because regular science that he kind of worships told him there ain't nothing we can do. So he goes to this Francis Collins. And goes under his treatment. Now, whether it's a valid treatment or not, you can't tell by one patient or not. We don't know if his cancer is doing better because the typical thing that happens when you go into hospitals, it claims that his actual cause of death was from hospital-acquired pneumonia. Hospital-acquired pneumonia is what he died from. So he got a lung infection while he was in the hospital going through whatever treatments. I'm not sure what was going on. Very, very interesting as usual. So he's a very man of great contradictions. He believes in this one way of thinking, which, of course, what's interesting is that the Marxists, while initially were very against alternative quantum physics, they later would embrace it. As we know, the Russians embraced all types of, quote, psychic practices because they worked. It's as simple as that. They weren't analyzing the science behind it. They were doing things and getting results. So to think in this very backwards way, which we would call conservative, which technically he wasn't, but he falls into that weird area which people don't understand. And that is understanding what things are. Like, the people don't understand that Nazism is not right-wing, it's left-wing. It's National Socialistic Movement was what the Nazis are. So the whole idea is that you have to understand that, and the Russians and the Nazis had the same exact. They were just rival socialist gangs. So the fact that he bought into this on one aspect and rejecting everything that isn't conservative, which is, again, a conflict. Well, you believe what conservative science tells you, not what is really facts or what works. So the point is that he's a pseudo-intellectual like so many, thinking he has answers. And of course, it isn't too difficult to argue against religion, because there's nothing there that you can come up with a statement. Prove there's God. Well, you can't do it. Plain and simple, you can't prove any of that. To believe in a comic book God, no matter what it is, beyond the archetypal understanding of, hey, this is an image you try and be. You want to be strong and powerful. You want to connect to certain energies. I mean, this is what people do. Maybe you want to see it as a moralistic guide, like you're too stupid. But, a lot of people are too stupid. Well, don't poke a stick in your eye. It says it here in the Bible. Oh, I was poking my eyes all the time. So this is the kind of hillbilly stupidity that apparently people want to glub onto as some sort of bizarre need for religion. Well, that's just basically common sense, and there isn't any out there that anybody that goes against that as a general understanding. So it's a very strange flopping into this conservative, being with conservatives, flopping into then what is considered socialistic, communistic belief systems. So it's a very bizarre thing. And he basically would flop to any side that he could make money with or get jobs with or were fashionable to a large extent. Certainly he had his own particular beliefs, and of course, as I said, coming out just like Penn Jillette does with his mute buddy, coming out and saying, well, gee, I'm a born-again Christian. You think that's going to fill up your halls, but you're going to get on TV? Well, no. Coming out as a skeptic, supporter of an atheist, gets you attention. And he plays that game very carefully, saying how wonderful he thinks Christians are. So the whole idea is that this is pretty much a very much of a strange viewpoint. It's got this Marxist, fashionist way of believing and a rationalist way, only believing in what you can physically touch and see. We all know this is kind of stupid. So to think like that and not get into all of that is a little bit absurd, especially in this time and age. But if you're always looking in the back, if you're going into the dusty old shelves of a university library, looking at all the classics that smart people don't even bother with, this is the kind of ignorant, buffoonish reality you're going to live in. But as I said, arguing against religion, well, can you lose that argument? Because they have nothing to say. They're going to go on ifs, ands, and buts, a bunch of literature that goes back thousands of years that has been changed thousands of times that really has no basis. I mean, we have a track record. If you were to track something, let's say you had a stock and you tracked it for 1,000 years and that stock never produced, I think we can safely say that that stock is shit. So the whole idea is that that's what all religion is. They've been around, Judaism 4,000 years, Buddhism probably 5,000 or 6,000 years. We have Christianity, which is 2,000, and we have Islam, which is 1,500 years old. Now, with all this, what has been produced from it? So, is the world perfect today? Are these religions making impacts and stopping conflicts? Well, the bottom line is generally these religions are all involved in the conflicts around the world, and if anything else, causing them. We can certainly see what's happening with Islam, which has two major sects, and apparently all they want to do is kill each other. How bizarre. So certainly they haven't done anything, and we can't see much that has been done through any kind of religious control or thought. The amusing part is certainly communism, non-religious, people-oriented supposedly, which is basically communism. Marxism is a little different, as I mentioned, but we can look at that, and they've had many, many years, and what happened? Nothing. They don't have great societies. It's pretty much an established thought that all of Eastern Europe, which are Russian satellites and so forth, have been nothing more than a horrible, criminal, brutal organization. They didn't grow in common wisdom, finding the purity of life. No, they went into horrible corruption, as the Soviet Union is, and their dictator Putin, and their entire society of corrupt people who are running all of Europe now, turning it into the sewer that they are doing with their Turkish and German allies. So the whole idea is that this is what's happening in the real world. So the point is Hitchens is so overrated it isn't even funny. His arguments are not profound. I mean, it's pretty easy to argue against religion because there's nothing they can come back with and tell you anything. All you have to do is have pretty much common sense. And it wouldn't be difficult. And I never really saw him go after people and talk about the real horrendous things that religion has done in a great detail. He tends to sidestep these things by making terse, basic statements. So, to think that he has a great wit, I think, is overestimating a common mind, someone who's put out there who had, because he was educated in good schools, was able to write well, and he was able to speak fairly well. But in terms of something profound, did he come up with anything profound? Did he do higher educational belief systems looking into the nature of the human consciousness and what goes with that, and understanding really, which is now accepted even by conservative scientists, of the actual quantum reality? No, absolutely zero. He brought really nothing here. He was known for his attacks on Christianity and was able to get away with it because of his pseudo-intellectual and that great British accent. He was so smart, you know. After all, we lost Bermuda. So the whole idea is that all of this that comes with that. And I never really, he came out in favor of the wars in the Middle East because of the problems and with Islam, and saw them as a great threat, which of course he was correct there. But he doesn't go much further than that. He did become a naturalized citizen of the United States, and claimed he had a great love for the United States. He became a naturalized citizen in 2007. And of course, he died in 2011, going under a new cancer treatment, as I said, unconfirmed in any way that this treatment had any value, and unproven. So he certainly didn't come out in his later years and fight for freedom of medical treatments. Nothing woke him up, even his own death. And I don't know if he stopped smoking or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't. His brothers, of course, started off as very much of a liberal. And of course, that's where that time was as well. So they grew up in that era of the 70s when everybody was a liberal. And of course, you pretty much had to be, or you had to be in constant conflict. So certainly, again, shows their lack of ultimate really contribution. To having balls to fight things. His brother became a conservative person in his later life. Again, there seems to be a great changing going on there, from basically being a socialist from 1969 to 75. Oh yeah, that's when it was popular. Yeah, it was good to do. Everybody patted you on the back. Then, of course, he became liberal after that. And we're talking about his brother. 1977 to 1983, he was in the Labor Party. This is the Liberal Party. Now, 1997, he was started in the Conservative Party. Oh, well, lots of confusion there, just like brother. So here we go with a understanding of what's going on to fully figure out what is popular at the time to make money from. And I don't know if it's something overly new, but he's credited with what is called the Hitchens razor. Which is the stating the fact that what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. Meaning, you don't have to, if someone makes a statement, it is the burden of proof is on the person saying it, not you. So if you're going to say something is valid, well, you have to come up with proof that it is valid. And that is certainly, I'm not sure how new that is, but he's been credited for pushing that reality. But the most fascinating thing I find out about people like this and Bill Maher, and there are several other people that come down to this belief system that they are so stuck in buying into society. And that's, of course, what all of these people do. They really buy into society to ultimately, while society is no good, ultimately it is good. Because that's what they really say. Now, because of the fact they won't commit to the ultimate gnosis, the ultimate truth, Hitchens had a serious problem with confronting the fact that there are a group of people running the world, causing all sorts of problems, and they're in control. He doesn't want to believe that. That disempowers him to a point where it frightens him. Bill Maher's like that too. He wants to drive his expensive cars and live in his Malibu mansions and be able to say, well, society is just basically good. We just have to clean up the bad ones. Well, that kind of fallacious garbage thinking, the sewer mentality that comes from, is destroying this world. Because in the end, they will side with the oppressors. So he had a serious problem with understanding that 9/11 was a giant government staged process, which is basically irrefutable. When you look at the evidence, all sorts of strange things happen there that, at the very least, just make you say, oh my God, what is going on here? Now, whether you want to connect that to some sort of direct conspiracies, I guess, is open to a certain amount of your own personal understandings. But it is so grossly apparent, and when you connect everything together, the pieces of this giant puzzle come together pretty clearly. And it just goes on and on of all the things. Yet he would not, like everything else, like he wouldn't look at the research involved in, quote, quantum physics. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that these kind of things were. And why is that? Well, all these people have to keep their mouths shut in that area or they don't have a living. Bill Maher is one of them, I allege, and Christopher Hitchens is the other. And of course, there are many others. But they don't want people going out and pushing these actual facts about what happened, because this upsets the power structure, and they're afraid people will actually start to prove it and believe it, and their towers will crumble down just the same way that they crumbled down the trade towers in that fateful day, that 9/11 day. So he doesn't want to look at the facts, like he didn't look at the facts of lots of things. So here we go on and on again. His pseudo-intellectual, his bogus buffoon understandings of life, other than the fact that, yeah, religion is bad and we can't prove. Well, that's right. Is that a great thought? Not really. The fact is there's no religious person of any merit that is going to try and tell you they can prove God or religion in general. The facts are against them. But if we were to take his kind of thoughts, he would be a conservative belief Christian, stating that everything in this book is proof unto itself. So the fact is that he wouldn't look into so many alternatives, that he wouldn't understand the fact of life called quantum physics, is a shocking revelation to his really ignorant way of portraying himself with a shiny British sophisticated cover that so many people like. But the bottom line is that once you open that cover, it's a cesspool of stupidity. And that is exactly what Christopher Hitchens was.